The Cragheart is a damage-dealing tank, giving and taking hits in equal measure, but with a nice variety of melee, ranged, and even direct damage-dealing abilities. In this 5th video in the Gloomhaven Starter Guide series, we'll go over Cragheart, his playstyle, and then jump into his level 1 cards and starting item recommendations. The Cragheart has tank level health with a starting value of 10 HP, and he has a bigger hand size at 11. These two facts set him up as a tank, but unlike the Brute, he has no abilities on his starting cards to provide him with any shields. Instead, his abilities focus more on damage both from range and melee, along with a bit of control and direct damage. What do I mean by direct damage? Direct damage is anything that causes a character to suffer damage without initiating an attack and drawing a modifier. Abilities that deal direct damage will use the term suffer damage or retaliate, as we've seen before, though retaliate abilities only trigger when we are attacked. Thus, these suffer abilities ignore shields, do not trigger retaliate abilities, and cannot miss since they are not an attack action. But the Cragheart has one more unique mechanic. He has abilities that can create and destroy obstacles, and even some that use obstacles to inflict more damage to enemies. On the negative side, Cragheart will also need the earth element a lot to be the most effective, but thankfully he can empower it on his own quite a bit. Finally, the biggest weakness of the Cragheart is his initiative values, as these are mostly around the middle, between 40 and 60, meaning Cragheart may have to adjust to enemy actions on the fly, more so than other classes. In general, with Cragheart, we will be jumping into the thick of it, trying to do as much damage as possible to as many enemies as possible. We could start by using ranged abilities to whittle enemies down, before jumping in to finish them off in melee, or we could just jump straight in, dealing damage and then taking damage for our team, before using our heal abilities to bring us back up to full health. As far as tanks go, the Cragheart is pretty flexible, allowing for a mix of playstyles. So with that basic idea in mind, let's jump over to the cards now and discuss the Cragheart's abilities in more detail. Our first card is Opposing Strike. The top here is an attack 3 on up to 2 enemies, with one being directly in front of us and the other directly behind, and it gives us 1 XP. Overall a decent top here, but getting the attack on the second enemy can be tricky. The bottom will give us a Retaliate 2 for the next 6 melee attacks targeting us, which can be great for some direct damage when fighting melee enemies. Over the course of the ability we can gain 3 XP, but this is a loss once it's gone. The initiative is a 46, which as I mentioned is Cragheart's weak point, as this number really isn't good for anything. Next up is Crushing Grasp. The top here is a nice damage and control ability with attack 3, immobilize, and activate Earth. If we can manage to go before our target, this attack is great for doing some damage and then moving away without them being able to follow us. The bottom is a loot 1, which is nice early on when we are trying to get our Cragheart kitted out. The initiative here is a little better at 35, but still not a great number. The next card, Avalanche, has a top that can be great in the early game for some burst damage against 2 targets. It is an attack 4 on 2 enemies, gain 1 XP, but if we have Earth, it becomes an attack 5 on the 2 enemies and we gain 2 XP. When everything lines up, this is a great attack to use, even if it is a loss ability. The bottom will allow us to create 2 single hex obstacles and empty hexes adjacent to us and activate Earth. This ability can be great for manipulating enemy paths and slowing enemies down, but it can be tricky to set up since this is a bottom ability and will have to be done in place of a move. Though at later levels it can become a little more useful with some unlockable cards. The initiative is a 75, which is actually decent for going late. Next we have Rumbling Advance. This one is one of my personal favorites when it comes to playing Cragheart. The top is a heal 4, range 2, which is actually a really strong heal at level 1, and can be great for getting the Cragheart back on his feet. The bottom, though, is why I like this card. This ability will allow us to move 2, then all adjacent allies and enemies suffer 1 damage, and activate Earth. Paired with some boots of striding to make this a move 4, this ability can help us get into position and damage enemies at the same time, while setting up the Earth element to be used on the next turn. This, for me, is a staple of the Cragheart, especially when facing enemies with innate shields. The initiative is a 29, which is almost fast enough to go early, but not quite. Massive Boulder is our next card. The top of this one is an attack 3, range 3, and all allies and enemies adjacent to the target suffer 1 damage. Here again is another great way to deal some direct damage to more than 1 enemy at a time, though as with Rumbling Advance, we have to be careful not to hurt our allies with this one if we can help it. The bottom ability is our first strong move with a move 4. The initiative is great for going late at 87. Then we have Backup Ammunition. The top ability will allow us to add a target on our next 4 ranged attacks and gain 1 XP each time for a loss. Personally, I've never actually used this one, but I can see how it could be very effective with something like Massive Boulder, as we would be able to spread a lot of damage around from the additional suffer damage. The bottom is a decent move 3, and the initiative is another good late one at 77. Next up, we have Rock Tunnel. The top of this one allows us to destroy 1 adjacent obstacle and gain 1 XP. I've rarely used this ability, but it can come in handy in a rare occasion where a path is blocked by obstacles and traps, and we need a way through without taking the trap damage. The bottom is a move 5 with jump, immobilize all enemies move through, and gain 1 XP for a loss. This is another situationally good card, but being a loss means we really have to find the right time, and I would much rather burn cards for attacks than moves whenever possible. The initiative is a middling 41, so not much use for the card in that regard. Speaking of attack loss cards, Unstable Upheaval is a great one. The top is an attack 3, targeting all adjacent enemies, gain 1 XP, but if we consume Earth, we can target all enemies up to 2 hexes away and gain another 1 XP. When we can use this to hit 3, 4, 5 or more enemies and power it up with advantage and a power potion, we can clear a room with this attack, or at least nearly do so. The downside is that any adjacent allies will suffer 2 damage, so be aware of that when planning to use this one. The bottom is another loss ability that will allow us to shield all allies for 2, regardless of where they are, and we gain 2 XP, though this shield comes at the cost of each ally also suffering 1 damage. Most, if not all the time, will want to use this card for the top, not the bottom. The initiative is our fast one at 13, so we will also want to hang on to this card for that reason alone, and have to consider that if we want to burn it. Crater is the next card, and the top of it is another ranged attack with attack 3, range 3, and if we consume Earth, push 2 and gain 1 XP. The attack itself is decent, but don't underestimate the power of pushes either. In maps that have traps or hazardous terrain, pushes can often end up doing more damage than our attacks. The bottom of Crater is another of my favorite abilities for the Cragheart. It makes all adjacent enemies and allies suffer 1 damage, and then we can move forward with jump, and upon landing do 1 more suffer damage to all adjacent enemies and allies and gain 1 XP. However, if we have Earth to use, we can do 2 damage instead of 1 after the move and gain 1 more XP. Now, this is a loss ability, but when used right, it can be great for softening up a group of enemies, especially when paired with another character's multi-target or AoE attack, not to mention it could be paired with Unstable Upheaval for some great burst damage. The initiative is a 61, continuing the Cragheart's initiative weakness. Next on the list is Dirt Tornado. The top is an attack 1, range 2, but in the huge 7 hex AoE pattern, and it inflicts muddle. With Earth, it can be upgraded to an attack 2 and gain 1 XP. The attack 1 or even 2 is pretty weak, but powered up with advantage or power potion can make it quite effective as an AoE attack, and the muddle can help reduce some of the incoming damage during the turn. The bottom is another move 3, and the initiative is our last good late one at 82. Our last level 1 card is Earthen Clod. The top is an attack 2, range 5, and if we have Earth to use, it also immobilizes and gives us 1 XP. The range 5 on this actually makes it quite useful, even if the attack power is a little low. It can be a good choice when entering a new room when we aren't sure how far into it the enemies are going to be. Odds are with range 5 we'll be able to hit something. The bottom is a heal 2, range 3, which can be paired with the heal 4 from the top of Rumbling Advance to get a quick 6 HP turnaround. The initiative is another lackluster one at 38. Moving into the X cards now, Heaving Swing is up first. The top is another attack 3, push 1, but if we push the target into an obstacle, we destroy the obstacle, the target suffers 2 damage, and we gain 1 XP. This is a great ability when there are obstacles to use on a map, but obviously becomes a little less useful on maps with few or no obstacles. The bottom adds +1 attack to all our range attacks during the round, which makes this good for pairing with an area attack like Dirt Tornado. The initiative is another middling 57. Next is Forceful Storm. This one has a top action with an attack 3, range 3, disarm, gain 1 XP for each enemy targeted, and activate wind in a 3 hex pattern for a loss. This ability can do quite a lot for us, but the disarm is the star here as this will keep the affected enemies from being able to attack us on their next turn. The bad thing is getting the most out of this attack can be hard, and we'll most often find ourselves using it on only 2 enemies instead of 3. The bottom will give us a +2 attack to all our melee attacks this round, which should pair really well with Unstable Upheaval, giving us an attack 5 with that one on multiple targets. The initiative is another pretty useless 53. Finally, we have Nature's Lift. The top is a heal 2, range 3, target 2, which for the Cragheart's general playstyle I find mostly useless compared to his other heal abilities, but I suppose if we have a party with few heal abilities, this one could come in handy. The bottom is another ability I don't see much use for either. This ability allows us to add +2 range to our next 6 ranged attacks while wind is strong, and then the card is lost afterwards. I don't like this one because the Cragheart only has one ability that activates wind, meaning we'd have to rely on wind being activated by other characters to even make use of this ability on a regular basis, and it really just isn't worth the loss. The initiative is a 64. Of the 3 X cards, I've probably used Heaving Swing the most, and this is a great one to swap in for something like Crushing Grass if you suspect you'll have obstacles to use. Forceful Storm can be good in the right situation, but using it or not comes down to personal preference. If I were to swap it in, I'd probably take out Rock Tunnel. Finally, I never use Nature's Lift, and the only time I could see it being an option is if our team was really light on healing abilities. That'll do it for the cards, so let's move over to the starting items now. Obviously, Cragheart is a tanky character who will find himself in melee a lot, so the Heater Shield is our first pickup. Next, let's grab the Boots of Striding, because our movement isn't that great out of the box. Next, I'd go for a Power Potion for our multi-target abilities, and once we've grabbed our perk that gives us immunity to negative item effects, we'll want to pick up the Hide Armor. Finally, for our other hand item, we can pick up the Poison Dagger. We could go Warhammer or Piercing Bow here too, though we'd have to give up our shield to do so. This choice really comes down to how much tanking you plan on doing as Cragheart, or how risky you want to play overall. The Cragheart, though his initiative can be pretty bad, is still a lot of fun to play with some unique abilities that cause direct damage, and a good mix of ranged and melee attacks. In fact, if you really aren't sure what kind of character you want to play, the Cragheart might be a good place to start, as he has a little bit of everything. Now it's time to hit that like button if you haven't, and if you want to see more Gloomhaven, check out this video right here. As always, thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and keep on gaming.